Hey there, in this video I'm going to show you another trick for playing music on the Texture Lab and the 8-bit warps, this time focusing on drums. And I'm going to start with the 8-bit warps and then move to the Texture Lab, but most of what I show you with one synth is going to be applicable to the other synth and vice versa. So without further ado, let's move over to the 8-bit warps. I've got about 20 of the new drum sounds that Sonicware recently released loaded onto my 8-bit warps. So we have a nice mixture of kicks and snares and toms and hi-hats and all that. And now what I'm going to do is this. So with sound locking on, very, very important here, I'm going to go into my empty pattern, just a 16-step pattern, hit the record button, and I'm going to put one of my drum sounds onto the first step, go with our kick, and then I'm going to select another drum sound, maybe that guy, and I'm going to record that on the next step, and then select another sound, maybe that one, and maybe just a couple more here, maybe that guy. And so now we have maybe another less powerful, more subtle sound. Let's go with that guy. Okay, so if we cycle through this pattern that we have so far, well, it doesn't sound that great, but that's not the point, because what we're basically doing here is we are creating a little drum kit. And I'm going to stop here on 5, but you could go all the way up to 15. However, the crucial thing is that you leave at least one step empty, and you're going to see why that's important in just a moment. All right, so I'm going to just leave it at 5, and now I'm going to exit recording. And next important thing, I am going to turn on stutter mode. Now, with stutter mode on, I'm going to park a finger from my right hand on that empty 16 step, and then I'm going to hit the play button for the pattern. And I have the metronome on, so you can hear that the pattern is getting played. However, since I have my finger pressed down on the empty 16 step, the playback is just getting parked there, and so we're just getting silence. And that silence is going to be crucial because what we can now do is this. So if I turn the play button on, still keeping my finger parked on the empty 16 step, I can hit any one of these buttons, and we're going to hear the sound when I press it down, and then we're going to go right back to silence when I lift up, since that's going to make the playback go to our empty 16 step. And maybe you see where I'm going with this, which is that we can play any one of those steps and we can play them in a rhythm, and that is going to allow us to finger drum like this. Now, as an extra little bonus feature, another thing we can do here is this. So I'm still holding down the 16 step. That's important because if I don't do that, we're just going to keep cycling through the sequence. So I'm still holding down the 16 button, and then what I'm going to do is this. If I hold down one of the steps, that step is going to get repeated for as long as we hold it down. Okay, now because we are toggling back and forth, half the time we're on the 5, and then half the time we're on the 16, which means we're playing that sound on the 5, then we have a little beat of silence, and then we go back to the 5. However, if we let go of the 16 while we're held down on the 5, we're going to effectively double the rate at which the step gets fired, which you can use to create some pretty cool effects when you are doing your finger drumming. So let me give an example of that. Okay, I've lost the beat there a little bit at the end, but you get the idea. Also, that reminds me of a point to make here, which is if you're not that great at finger drumming, or rhythm and drums in general, which is definitely the case for me, this is a great way of practicing. However, it's also just a great way of coming up with some drum loops, which you can then use for jamming. So let me show you that next. So there are actually two ways of doing this. So for the first one, all I'm going to do is in looper mode, I am going to cue up one of my loop tracks. I'm going to park my finger on the 16 like usual, and the moment I press the play button, our loop is going to start recording, which means that I need to start playing the drums immediately to get the loop that I want. And this can be a little bit tricky, and your timing needs to be good. If you have trouble with this, though, don't worry, because the next method I'm going to show you takes care of the problem for you. But let me just show you this one real quick. And there you have it. So now that drum is recorded onto our first loop track. And if I want to make it more complex, could also use another track. But before I do anything like that, let me just show you the other method for recording a drum loop, which is this. So this time what I'm going to do is first I'm going to go into my loop settings and I'm going to make sure my quantization is set on a pretty high number. And I actually go sometimes all the way up to 128. But in any case, here is what you're going to be doing. So first of all, I'm going to park my finger on the 16, hit the play button. And then after my pattern has started to play, I'm going to then cue up one of my loop tracks like this. And you can see how it's flashing. And what it's going to do is, with the quantization turned on, it's going to wait until the specified number of steps have elapsed playing on your pattern, and then it's going to automatically start recording. And what I can do in the meantime is, as the loop is waiting to start recording, I can practice what I want to play, get into kind of a groove, and then sometime in the middle of me already getting into the groove and already playing my drum, the recording will start, and if all goes well, we'll end up getting a really good version of the pattern recorded onto the loop track. So let's give that a try. And there you have it. Now I have that pattern saved onto this loop track. Okay, so now I want to add another part to my drum on the second track. So let's play the first track. Park my finger on 16, hit play. And there you have it. So I did basically the same exact thing as before, just on track 2, making use of that kind of automatic repeating effect to get a really rapid hi-hat or whatever sound we want to call that. And now I still have another whole track left that I can use for chords or whatever I want. So just to close this off, let's try that out. Okay, I'm happy with that. Notice how I'm turning off the tracks by turning down the volume instead of just turning them off. And that's because the syncing can actually be a little bit weird since everything's being done manually. And if you turn them off, it can be tricky to get them playing again in sync with each other. All right, so now to close this off, I just need to find a nice little lead sound. Okay, I think I found something I like. This sound. And you know what? I just had another idea. I have this Roland E4 I haven't been using enough. I've got this microphone plugged into it. We've got a whole 4th track not being used here, which can be used for external input. So let's make use of that. That was the 8-bit warps. Let's move over to the Texture Lab now. Okay, so with the Texture Lab, we're going to need to start with a drum sample. And I'm going to use the built-in Ski Beats kit on the simple track for this, although you could do it with any sound source you want. And in any case, the way that you want to do it is you want to play a series of drum kit sounds, one after another, with little gaps of silence in between each sound. And you also want to get a nice variety of sounds so that you get a good, versatile mini drum kit. And I say mini here because remember the Texture Lab only has a 6-second sample window, so you're only going to be able to fit maybe 4, 5, or 6 sounds into your drum kit on the Texture Lab. Okay, so let's get the Texture Lab ready. Let's cue this up and start playing the sounds. And I actually got 7 sounds in there, which is more than I've done in the past. That also means I have less of a gap of silence in between each sound, but I guess if you're seeing this in the video and I didn't edit it out, that means that it's going to turn out that it works all right. And if it doesn't work out, you're never going to see this, and I am essentially just talking to myself right now. Okay, so I've got the sample loaded onto an empty pattern. By default, in an empty pattern, you're going to have some reverb on, and that can really mess with the sound of the drums. So for starters here, I'm going to turn the reverb completely off. I might bring it back in a little bit later. And then the other thing to keep in mind is that your granular blend is set to the midway point by default, and I'm also going to turn that all the way over to the left so that we're just on the dry side of the blend, and we're just getting the sound of the original sample. Again, we're going to change this later, but this is just to get us started. Okay, now the next thing I'm going to do is this. So the length of our sample is by default all the way at the final value of 127. I'm going to decrease the length until I'm only getting the first sound. So imagine this is our first sound and then this is our second sound. I want to get the length so that it's right at the very end here, like the very moment before we start hearing that second sound. Or in other words, I want to make this as long as it possibly can be until we get to the next sound. And this just takes some trial and error. Okay, 47 seems to be the magic value here. Yours is going to differ though, of course. Now the second thing I'm going to do has to do with the release. And here's the thing, right now with the default value of 84, if I just press down on the neutral C key and immediately lift off the key, notice how the sample starts repeating. And that's because if our release window is like this and our sample is a little bit shorter, then when we get to that gap at the end, the Texture Lab is just going to start repeating the sample. So the second thing that we want to do here is decrease the release so that we get those two windows exactly coinciding. And in other words, we're trying to get the release to be as long as it can be without getting that repeating. So again, just got to play it by ear here. I'm going to decrease to, 70. Okay, that's working. Let's see if we can bump it up a little bit. Yeah. Yeah. Good. Okay, I heard a tiny bit of repeat at the end there, so let's dial it back. 74. Oh, and I hear a tiny bit there as well. Okay, I think 73 is our magic number here. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go into recording mode and I'm going to record the neutral C key onto the first 7 steps since I have 7 sounds in this drum kit. And now I'm going to go back to the second step, not the first step, because the first step is already taking care of our first sound and it's the second sound that we want to take care of next. So I'm going to go to the second step and I'm going to move the position until we get to the second sound. Okay, I think we have it there, but an important thing to look out for here is that if this is the second sound, we want to get right at the beginning there. For a little bit early, then there's going to be a little gap of silence between pressing down the key and getting the sound, which is something you really don't want for a drum sample where everything needs to be very rhythmically precise. And if we start even a little bit late, we're going to cut off the beginning of the sound, which we also don't want. So right now I'm parked in an empty step so that we don't hear the sample getting repeated and I don't drive us crazy. The way to test this is just to go back to one of your steps that you're working on, press the button and see if it seems really responsive. Like, do you hear the sound immediately? And in that case, yes, I do. And so there you go. With the first 2 sounds, we're already in business here. And now I'm just going to repeat the same process. So for step 3, I'm going to toggle the position until I get to the third sound. I think we're good. Same thing with the 4th. Same thing with 5. Same thing with 6. Okay, let's test all these out now. And okay, I think we're good to go. Okay, so now at this point, we could actually just play the drums by staying in recording mode and just going back and forth between different steps. And you could do this on the 8-bit warps as well. 2 things to keep in mind though. The first is that if you stay in a step, the sample is going to get repeated. So if you want silence, you do have to park in one of these empty steps. And then the other thing to keep in mind with the 8-bit warps is that this doesn't work for recording into the internal looper. So you'd only do this if you just wanted to play the drums or if you were recording to an external source. Alternatively, we could do this the same way we did with the 8-bit warps, where we exit recording mode, turn on stutter, park our finger on one of the empty steps. You could also get just a heavy object and keep this down, and then you'd have both hands free. And now we can finger drum once again. As on the 8-bit warps, we can make use of the stuttering effect to repeat any one of these sounds. And we can make use of putting down or lifting up our fingers on the empty steps to increase or decrease the rate of that repeating. So for example, if I hold down 4 fingers, 3, 2, 1, 0, and so you can get a nice build-up effect that way. Another thing to keep in mind, both with the Texture Lab and with the 8-bit warps, is that if the sounds of the drum aren't feeling responsive enough, or in other words, if you're trying to drum faster than it seems like the synthesizer can keep up with, so for example, if I try to go boom, 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 the Texture Lab just isn't switching between the different steps fast enough to keep up with the rhythm I'm trying to play. But there are 2 ways to get around this. The first, and maybe more obvious one, is just to turn up the tempo. Let's try doubling it to 240, for example. And now it's going to be super responsive, which is about as fast as I can finger drum. Now, a couple little things to keep in mind here are that, first of all, in addition to being super responsive now, it's also going to start repeating much quicker, twice as fast as when we had the BPM set to 120. So if I hold this down, it's going to go super, super fast, especially if I lift off the empty step. Now we're getting into like jackhammer territory. Keep that in mind when you're playing this, because it's going to be very easy to play the same step twice by accident. Although you can use this as a purposeful effect and get sort of like a double tap sound on the drum. Something like that. Another thing to keep in mind here is that if we increase the BPM, then if we turn on the metronome, it's going to be super fast. So to get around that, if you want to use the metronome, another thing you can do here is dial the BPM back to 120 or whatever you were starting off with. And then instead of increasing the BPM, we're going to decrease the length of the note. We're going to cut it in half from 1/16 to 1/32. And now if we press on one of the steps, it's just as fast as before, but if we turn on the metronome, it's at 120. Anyways, I mentioned this thing with the metronome because it's especially important over on the 8-bit warps, where you really do need the metronome in order to record an accurate rhythm onto the looper. Anyway, that is the basics of setting up the Texture Lab as a kind of finger drumming machine. And something you might be wondering here is, well, what is the point of doing that in the first place? I mean, after all, I got that drum sample from the sample track, and I could already do finger drumming on there if I wanted to, and in fact it would be a much better experience because the sample track has these velocity sensitive pads. They're actually really, really good, and definitely much better than the plastic keys on the Texture Lab. So that's a very fair question. And I guess what I'd say is the point of doing this is that now we're setting ourselves up to be able to manipulate these drum sounds by playing around with the knobs. And there's a whole lot that we could talk about with that, but I think I'm going to actually save it for another video because I want to keep this one kind of more focused on just the basic technique here. And I will put a link to that separate video below when the video is ready. In the meantime, let me just give you a quick preview of what you can do with manipulating the sounds. Okay, so I modified that into a new drum kit that sounds like this, which sounds slightly deranged, and we can use to create something that sounds like this. So you can get some pretty distorted and experimental sounding drums out of this thing. That brings me to the end of this video. If you liked it and you'd like to see more, please consider giving the video a like and subscribing to the channel. Even just a like really helps the channel out with the stupid algorithm, and I would really appreciate it. Anyway, I hope you have a great day, and I hope to see you again soon in another video. In the meantime, have fun drumming, and goodbye for now.